When you think about scams or cheating in bowling, you probably think about things like sandbagging, somebody manipulating their average, or maybe even somebody using illegal equipment. But some of the biggest scams in bowling have involved something else, and that is money. Because over the years, bowlers have turned up expecting thousands of dollars in prize money, only to discover that the money was gone, and in some cases, so was the person who was supposed to be looking after it. There have been many cases of league funds disappearing, allegations of bracket manipulation, and bowling officials being accused of taking tens of thousands of dollars belonging to bowlers. And one of the most incredible cases involved more than $60,000 allegedly disappearing from bowling league funds. And that's just one of the several bizarre cases that we will look at in today's video, because once you start digging into the history of bowling, you discover that the sport has had its fair share of scandals, and some of them involved rather serious amounts of money. Let's start with our first case, and it's perhaps the perfect example of how badly things can go wrong when one person has control of a bowling league's money. We have to go back to 1985 for this story, and we find a bowling league in Charles County who were preparing for its end of season awards banquet. Throughout the season, money had accumulated for prizes, and by the time the banquet arrived, approximately $35,000 was reportedly due to be distributed. Now, that's a significant amount of money today, but in 1985, that was enormous, and the man responsible for the money in this case was league treasurer Herb Minton. Everything should have been straightforward. The bowlers turn up, the league distributes the prize fund, and everybody goes home happy. Except Minton didn't arrive, and according to reports at the time, word was sent that he'd apparently been involved in a car accident and therefore could not attend the banquet. Now, obviously, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. That was until people actually tried to find him. League officials reportedly couldn't locate Minton at his home, and they couldn't find him at his workplace either. And of course, there was another rather more serious problem to deal with, and that was they couldn't find the $35,000 in prize fund. The situation became serious enough that Maryland State Police became involved, and an arrest warrant was eventually issued charging Minton with grand theft and embezzlement. But just imagine being one of the bowlers at that banquet. You've paid into the league for an entire season, you're expecting your prize money, and instead you discover that the person responsible for around $35,000 has seemingly vanished. What would you do in a situation like that? Well, I'm sure some of you would say you would go straight round to his house to find out what on earth is going on. But if you think that's a lot of missing bowling money, then we need to jump forward 40 years because another case involved an even larger amount. In January 2025, authorities in Virginia began investigating a complaint involving league funds in Yorktown, and the person responsible for managing those funds was Stephanie Van Dusen. And according to investigators, this wasn't a case of just a few $100s being unaccounted for, it was allegedly more than $60,000. Police alleged the money had been taken between August 24 and January 25. Van Dusen was subsequently arrested and charged with embezzlement. However, it's important to make the distinction here that these were allegations at the time of the reporting, and of course an arrest or charge isn't the same thing as a conviction, and it's the same with the previous case that we looked at as well with Herb Minton. Yes, they were both arrested and charged, but I couldn't find any information available to say whether they were convicted or found guilty or not guilty. So in both of those cases with Minton and Van Dusen, we can't say whether they were guilty or not because these were just allegations. But why it's interesting to look at these stories is that the amount involved, particularly in both of these cases in terms of the money, demonstrates something quite important about bowling leagues. You've obviously got a huge amount of money sitting in these funds. You've got dozens of teams, bowlers who are paying every week, and that money can quickly accumulate after just a few short weeks and months. And when you multiply that across a large league or indeed several leagues, suddenly one person can potentially have access to tens of thousands of dollars belonging to bowlers. And in the majority of cases, that's absolutely no problem because the person is honest and trustworthy. And even though we don't know whether these two individuals were guilty or not guilty, it does provide a valuable lesson of what can happen. And indeed, what has happened in many other cases. I'm sure there will be many of you out there who have stories where league officials or tournament officials ran off with a lot of money. And we could look to another example to show what can happen when you have a person with access to money not just from one league, but several leagues. There was another case centered around Cotton Bowl lanes in South Haven, Mississippi, and the bowling center's owner, Thomas Hart, was accused of embezzling money belonging to league bowlers at the center. And again, we're not talking about a small amount. The amount connected to the case reportedly approached $47,000. And this money wasn't just connected with one league, it reportedly belonged to 4 different bowling leagues. Bowlers had apparently attempted to obtain their prize money, but were unable to do so. Hart ultimately entered a pre-trial intervention program for first-time non-violent offenders with repayment of the money required. But this case highlights something slightly different, because this wasn't just a random bowler being trusted to look after a league account. This involved an owner of a bowling centre itself. And when you combine this case with the others we've looked at, you start to see why leagues and tournaments need very clear safeguards around their money. Multiple signatures, transparent accounts, regular statements, and ideally, no situation where one person has complete control over such a large amount of money. But money simply disappearing isn't the only way bowlers can potentially get scammed, because things can get even more complicated when we start talking about tournament bowling. Because tournament bowling can involve enormous amounts of money with entry fees, side pots, brackets, optional events, and of course, the main prize fund. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of bowlers might hand over money before a single ball has actually been thrown, and most of the time everything works exactly as it should. But that system does rely heavily on trust. And if you're entering a bracket, for example, you're trusting that the bracket you're shown is the bracket that's actually going to be used. You're trusting that everything is above board and has been accounted for. And that brings us to a much more recent controversy, and it was to do with brackets. In 2026, a bowler described an incident online involving paid brackets at a doubles tournament. According to their account, their daughter entered multiple brackets. Game 1 was bowled, and she apparently won her matchups and advanced. Nothing unusual there, except later, the brackets ended up changing. According to the poster, the matchups had been reshuffled after bowling had already begun. And that meant the opponent she had supposedly faced in game 1 of the bracket was now different, and that change meant she no longer advanced. Now, the explanation that was given apparently was an incorrect bowler had originally been entered and the brackets therefore needed to be redrawn. And that does sound like a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I will stress again, there is no evidence here establishing that this was a deliberate scam. Mistakes happen when tournaments are being run, and occasionally brackets do need correcting. But the reason I mention it is because it's another fascinating example of why transparency is so important. And again, I know there have been stories of similar things with brackets going on in tournaments. And again, I'm sure you've got many stories that I would love to hear in the comment section below. And if you're running the bracket, you have the ability technically to see the scores and rearrange the bracket if you so wanted to, so you can understand why bowlers might become suspicious. There is a lot of responsibility and a lot of trust involved in a situation like this. But after hearing stories involving such large amounts of money, there's an obvious question. How can you stop it happening to your league or tournament? Well, there's some relatively simple ways that leagues and tournaments can protect themselves. Mainly, don't let one person control everything, and that's probably the most important one, If one person collects all the money, controls the bank account, keeps all the records and makes the payout, then that creates a potential problem where really leagues should consider having at least 2 officers involved in financial affairs with regular checks of the account. Now that doesn't mean you don't trust your treasurer or indeed your tournament director. It's actually protecting the treasurer and the committee members as well, because if everything is double checked by multiple people, independently verified, nobody can later accuse one person of taking money that was actually spent legitimately. So it's about protecting all of those people involved in the running and the financial affairs of leagues and tournaments. The other thing you can do is to keep money in a proper account. League prize funds shouldn't really be sitting in somebody's house or mixed in with their personal money, but it does go on. If thousands or potentially tens of thousands of dollars are accumulating throughout a season, there should be a clear record showing exactly how much there is and where that money is kept. And most importantly, bowlers should be able to see that record. Because imagine paying into a league a whole season and discovering at the end that nobody actually checked whether the money was still there, because by then it's too late. You don't actually have to wait until the payout night to find out if something is not quite right. If the league has collected $20,000 towards its prize fund, then the accounts should show that to reflect the prize fund, and publishing regular financial reports means that discrepancies can potentially be discovered sooner rather than later. Likewise with tournaments, tournament organisers can do something similar, and they can just have the information there for the bowlers. For example, things like how much of each entry is going towards lineage, what's going into the expenses, how much goes into the prize fund. But the important thing is that the entrants should understand what they're paying for and where that money is going, etc. Same thing with brackets. Transparency and openness and record keeping is the key here. And finally, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask where your money is, where the money is, how much it is. Ask for the records if you want to see it. Now, some treasurers or tournament directors might not be too happy about this, but what they need to remember is that nobody is accusing them, and that any bowler in a league or tournament has the right to request to see the accounts at any time they want. That is their right, and it's not an accusation to ask to see those accounts and financial reports. So if you've paid into a league prize fund for months, asking to see the league's financial records shouldn't be considered insulting. If you've paid into a tournament or bracket and side pots, asking just how the payout was calculated shouldn't be controversial. Having this information helps everybody involved, but really to make sure there are no innocent mistakes as well, because mistakes always can happen. Because if we're honest, we all remember the horror stories. We've all heard these kind of stories before. But the thing to remember is that the vast majority of people who give up their time to run leagues and tournaments give up their time for nothing in return. They are honest people just trying to bring something to the bowling community. So these safeguards aren't about treating everyone like a potential thief. They're just making sure that everybody is protected and that one dishonest person can't ruin an entire league or tournament. Because when there's serious money involved, trust alone isn't enough. Well, that will bring us to an end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Well, if you have enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit the subscribe button below. Well, that's going to do it from me for today. And as always, thank you, bowling fans, and see you all next time.